Sometimes the best things in life come when you've got nothing left to lose. Corinne Vale knew that feeling well when she handed over $400 for 30 acres of forest nobody else wanted. The land sat quiet on the edge of Pine Ridge, Montana. 30 years back, a man walked into those woods and never came out. Folks searched for weeks but found nothing. Most people stayed away after that. But Corinne needed a place to call her own, and she didn't scare easy. She walked into that forest with an old canvas bag and a heart full of hope. What she found changed everything. What was hiding in those trees that everyone else missed? Before we go on, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've got something special waiting for you. Corinne Vale had learned a long time ago that life doesn't always give you what you want, but sometimes it gives you what you need. She turned 53 that spring, and the years had been harder than she'd hoped they'd be. Her husband Robert had passed 5 years earlier, taken by cancer that moved through him like wildfire. One day he was splitting wood behind their rental cabin. The next, he was in a hospital bed, telling her he loved her one last time. The insurance money ran out faster than anyone said it would. Medical bills came first, then the funeral, then the everyday expenses that don't stop just because your heart is broken. She'd worked as a waitress at the Timber Lodge restaurant, cleaned houses for the wealthier folks in town, and took on odd jobs wherever she could find them. Pride didn't put food on the table, so she swallowed it and did what needed doing. Pine Ridge, Montana wasn't the kind of place that showed up on many maps anymore. It had been a logging town once, back when the forests were thick and the timber companies paid good wages. Those days were long gone. Now the town was mostly older folks who'd stayed because they didn't know where else to go, and a handful of younger families who couldn't afford to leave. The main street had more boarded-up storefronts than open businesses. The diner still served breakfast, the hardware store still sold nails and rope, and the post office still delivered mail 3 days a week. That was about it. Corinne lived in a small cabin on the eastern edge of town, a place she rented month to month from a landlord in Billings who'd never once visited the property. The cabin was old but sturdy, with a wood stove that kept her warm through the winters and a front porch where she could sit and watch the mountains in the distance. It wasn't much, but it was hers for as long as she could pay the rent. Her neighbor was a woman named Violet Marsh, maybe 10 years older than Corinne. With silver hair, she kept in a long braid and eyes that seemed to see more than most people's. Violet had lived in Pine Ridge her whole life, or so everyone said. She knew every story, every rumor, every skeleton in every closet. She'd bring Corinne fresh bread sometimes or a jar of preserves, and they'd sit on the porch and talk about nothing in particular. Violet was the kind of friend who didn't need many words to understand what you were going through. It was Violet who first told Corinne about the estate sale. Old Franklin Pierce had died at 92, and his children wanted nothing to do with Pine Ridge or the property he'd accumulated over the years. They were selling everything off cheap just to be rid of it. Corinne had gone to the sale out of curiosity more than anything else. She didn't have money for antiques or collectibles. But when she saw the land deed for 30 acres of forest, something in her chest tightened. The auctioneer was a tired-looking man with reading glasses that kept sliding down his nose. He held up the deed and said the opening bid was $300. Nobody raised a hand. He dropped it to $200. Still nothing. The crowd was mostly locals, and they all knew what land he was selling. Corinne could feel their discomfort, the way they shifted their weight and looked at their shoes. "It's the Cordell land," someone whispered behind her. "Nobody wants that place." The auctioneer looked around the room one more time, then sighed. "Last call. Do I hear $100? Corinne raised her hand before she could talk herself out of it. "400, she said loud enough for everyone to hear. The room went quiet. People turned to stare at her. The auctioneer blinked, then smiled. "Well now. $400 to the lady in the back. Anyone want to counter?" He waited, but nobody moved. "Sold to Miss Vale for $400. After the auction, Lucas Gray cornered her by the refreshment table. Lucas owned the hardware store and had a reputation as a straight shooter. He was in his early 60s, with calloused hands and a face weathered by mountain winters. "You sure about this, Corinne?" he asked, his voice low. "That land's got a history." "I know the history," she said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Man went missing there 30 years ago. They never found him. James Cordell," Lucas said. "He was a drifter," they said, hitchhiking through. Last person to see him was Margie at the diner. He had breakfast, paid his bill, and walked out toward the forest. "Never came back," Corinne met his eyes. "People go missing sometimes, Lucas. Doesn't mean the land is cursed." "Maybe not cursed," he said carefully. "But folks around here have long memories. The search party spent 2 weeks combing those woods. Found nothing. Not a scrap of clothing, not a footprint, nothing. Some of the men who searched said they felt watched the whole time. Said the forest didn't want them there." She took a sip of her coffee. "It was weak and bitter, but it was hot. I need land I can afford, Lucas. This is it. I'm going to build a little homestead out there. Grow some vegetables, maybe keep a few chickens. Live simple." Lucas studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "If anyone can handle it, I suppose it's you. You need supplies. You come see me. I'll make sure you get a fair price." That night, Corinne sat at her kitchen table with the deed spread out in front of her. The paper was old and yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. 30 acres of mixed forest, mostly pine and fir, with a creek running through the eastern section. No structures, no improvements, no road access. The nearest trailhead was a mile hike from where you could park a vehicle. She thought about Robert, about how much he'd loved the wilderness. He'd grown up in Montana, knew the mountains like most people knew their own neighborhoods. They'd gone camping together when they were younger, before the cancer, before the medical bills. He'd taught her how to read a compass, how to tell direction by the moss on the trees, how to find water by listening to the land. "This is for us," she whispered to the empty room. "For the life we should have had." The next morning she went to see Sheriff Tom Brennan. His office was in the old municipal building, a drafty place with water-stained ceiling tiles and fluorescent lights that flickered. Brennan was in his late 50s, with grey hair cut military short and a face that had seen too many disappointments. He looked up when she knocked on his open door. "Corinne," he said, gesturing to a chair. "What can I do for you?" She sat down and placed the deed on his desk. "I bought the old Pierce Forest property. The section where James Cordell disappeared back in '95. I wanted to let you know I'll be spending time out there, in case anyone reports seeing someone in the woods." Brennan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "You bought that land." "I did." He leaned back in his chair, the springs creaking under his weight. "Corinne, I'm going to speak plainly with you. I was a rookie deputy when Cordell went missing. I was part of the search party. We looked everywhere. It's rough country out there, easy to get turned around, easy to have an accident. If he fell into a ravine or got hurt and couldn't call for help, well, the forest takes care of things in its own way." "I understand that," she said. "Do you?" He picked up a pen, tapped it against his desk. "Because some folks in this town have opinions about that land. Some folks think the case should have been investigated more thoroughly. And some folks think it's better to let sleeping dogs lie." Corinne held his gaze. "Which kind of folks are you, Sheriff?" He was quiet for a moment. "The kind who wants to keep the peace. You go out there, you be careful. You find anything unusual, you call me first. Don't go spreading rumors or stirring up old troubles. Agreed?" "Agreed," she said. Though something in his tone bothered her, she spent the next week preparing. She bought a good backpack from Lucas, along with a tent, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, a water filter, and a basic first aid kit. She packed non-perishable food, extra socks, a headlamp, and a hand-crank radio. In her husband's old leather journal, she made notes and sketches, planning where she might clear a spot for a cabin where the garden could go. How she'd manage water from the creek. Violet came over the evening before Corinne's first trek into the forest. She brought a thermos of soup and a loaf of bread still warm from the oven. They sat on the porch as the sun dropped behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. "You're really going through with this," Violet said. "It wasn't a question." "I am." Violet was quiet for a long moment, watching the light fade. "There are things people don't talk about in this town, Corinne. Old things. James Cordell wasn't just some drifter passing through. That's what they said, but it wasn't the whole truth. Corinne turned to look at her. What do you mean? I mean, people lie, Violet said softly. Sometimes to protect themselves, sometimes to protect themselves, sometimes to protect others, and sometimes because the truth is too complicated to explain. She reached over and squeezed Corinne's hand. You be careful out there. Trust your instincts. And if something doesn't feel right, you come back to town. Don't let pride or stubbornness keep you in a dangerous place. I won't, Corinne promised. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Corinne loaded her backpack into the bed of her old pickup truck and drove to the trailhead. The road was rough, more gravel and potholes than pavement, and it ended at a small clearing where hunters sometimes parked during deer season. She shouldered her pack, locked the truck and started walking. The forest opened before her like a cathedral. The trees were massive, their trunks thick with age, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into soft green columns. The ground was carpeted with pine needles and moss, and the air smelled of resin and earth. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. Robert would have loved this. She walked for over an hour, following a faint game trail that wound deeper into her property. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional call of a bird or the rustle of wind through the branches. She felt the weight of the forest around her, the sense of being in a place that had existed long before she was born and would exist long after she was gone. When she found a small clearing beside the creek, she decided to make camp. The water was clear and cold, running over smooth stones. She set up her tent, filtered water for drinking, and ate a simple lunch of crackers and cheese. Then she pulled out her journal and began to sketch the area, noting landmarks and distances. As the afternoon wore on, she explored further. She found deer trails and animal tracks, the remains of an old campfire ring, and several trees with initials carved into their bark. Most of the carvings were weathered and old, but they showed that people had been here before, that this forest had stories to tell. As the sun began to set, Corinne returned to her camp. She built a small fire and sat watching the flames, feeling the day settle into her bones. Tomorrow she'd explore more. Tomorrow she'd begin to understand this place. For now, she was content to simply be here. In the forest she'd bought for $400, on the land that everyone else had been afraid to claim. The fire crackled, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the growing darkness. Corinne pulled Robert's journal from her pack and opened it to a fresh page. At the top, she wrote a single sentence, Day 1. I'm home. On her third day in the forest, Corinne found the trail that wasn't on any map. She'd been following the creek upstream, looking for the property boundary markers that should have been somewhere in the northern section. The morning was cool and misty, the kind of weather that made everything look softer, more distant. She'd learned to move quietly through the woods, to watch where she placed her feet, to pay attention to the small details that told a story about the land. That's when she noticed it, a break in the underbrush that looked almost deliberate. Not a game trail exactly, but something that had been a path once. She pushed aside a low-hanging branch and found herself looking at an overgrown route that wound up the hillside, marked by stones placed at intervals along its edge. Someone had built this trail. Someone had maintained it at least for a while. Corinne hesitated only a moment before following it. The path climbed steadily, switching back and forth as it gained elevation. The trees grew thicker here, their branches interlocking overhead to block out most of the sunlight. The temperature dropped noticeably, and she found herself pulling her jacket tighter. After about 20 minutes of hiking, she found the trail marker. It was a wooden post, weathered grey with age, barely visible among the ferns and moss. Someone had carved an arrow into it, pointing further up the mountain. And at the base of the post, half buried in the soft earth, something glinted in the filtered light. She knelt down and carefully brushed away the dirt and pine needles. It was a compass, old and rusted, the kind that might have been carried by a hiker or hunter. The brass casing was tarnished green, and the glass face was cracked, but it was still intact. She picked it up gently, turning it over in her hands, The needle spun erratically, never settling on a direction. She held it flat, waiting for it to stabilize, but it just kept rotating as if it couldn't find north. That wasn't normal. Even a damaged compass should eventually point in the right direction, pulled by the Earth's magnetic field. Corinne stood up slowly, holding the compass in her palm. A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. She looked around, suddenly aware of how quiet the forest had become. No birds sang. No squirrels chattered in the branches. The silence pressed against her ears like water. She slipped the compass into her pocket and continued up the trail. The path led to a small plateau, a level area maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by dense pine trees. Here she found more signs of human presence. There were remnants of an old campsite, a circle of stones that had once contained a fire, a rusty tin can, and several pieces of frayed rope tied to tree trunks. One of the ropes extended further into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. Corinne approached the nearest tree and examined the rope. It was old, but had been good quality once, the kind used for climbing or securing loads. Someone had tied it with a proper knot, not the fumbling effort of an amateur. She followed it with her eyes, watching as it stretched deeper into the forest, marking a route through the trees. She checked her watch. It was already past noon, and she'd need to start back to her camp soon if she wanted to make it before dark. But something about this place pulled at her, demanded attention. She took out her phone and snapped several photos, knowing they'd be useless without cell signal, but wanting the documentation anyway. As she turned to leave, she noticed the carvings. They were on several of the trees surrounding the plateau, carved at about eye level. Initials, mostly, and dates: JC 1995, RT 1996. Some of the letters were so weathered she could barely make them out. But one carving was clearer than the others, as if someone had retraced it more recently. Still watching. The words made her stomach tighten. Still watching. Present tense. As if whoever carved it had been here not 30 years ago, but recently. Corinne backed away from the tree, her heart beating faster. She turned in a slow circle, scanning the forest around her. The trees stood silent and still, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone, that somewhere in the shadows something was paying attention. She left the plateau quickly, following the trail back down to the creek. She didn't run. Pride wouldn't let her, but she moved faster than she had on the way up, her hand resting on the compass in her pocket like a talisman. When she reached her camp, the sun was already dropping toward the western mountains. She built up her fire larger than she needed, grateful for the light and warmth. She made herself eat dinner, even though her appetite had vanished, knowing she needed the energy. Then she sat by the fire and examined the compass more carefully. The brass was old, probably from the 1980s or earlier. The manufacturer's mark was still visible on the back. Pathfinder, Denver, Colorado. It had been a good compass once, reliable and well made. But something had damaged it, bent the internal mechanism enough that the needle couldn't find its proper orientation. She thought about the rope, the carvings, the feeling of being watched. Sheriff Brennan had said the search party spent 2 weeks in these woods looking for James Cordell. Had they found this plateau? Had they seen these signs of human activity? Or had they missed it, focused on the easier terrain, closer to town? And what about those initials? JC could be James Cordell. The date matched. 1995 was the year he disappeared. But RT 1996? Who was that? Had someone else come here after Cordell vanished? She pulled out her journal and made detailed notes about everything she'd found. She sketched the plateau, marked the location of the trail marker, and copied down all the carvings she could remember. In the morning, she'd go back to town. She'd talk to Violet, maybe do some research at the library, and she'd talk to Sheriff Brennan again, whether he wanted to hear it or not. That night, she lay in her tent listening to the forest sounds. The creek burbled over stones. An owl hooted somewhere in the darkness. The wind sighed through the branches. Normal sounds, familiar sounds. But underneath them, or maybe just in her imagination, she thought she heard something else. Footsteps. Careful, deliberate footsteps moving through the trees. She unzipped her tent flap and looked out at her campsite. The fire had burned down to embers, glowing red in the darkness. Beyond the small circle of light, the forest was an impenetrable wall of black. She watched for a long time, her breath misting in the cold air, but saw nothing. Finally, she zipped the tent closed and lay back down, the compass clutched in her hand. Tomorrow she'd get answers. Tomorrow she'd start to understand what had really happened to James Cordell, and why everyone in Pine Ridge seemed so eager to forget. But tonight, alone in the forest, with the weight of 30 years of silence pressing down around her, Corinne Vale made herself a promise. She wouldn't be frightened away. She wouldn't be warned off. This was her land, bought and paid for, and whatever secrets it held, she would find them. The compass needle spun slowly in her palm, searching for a north it would never find. And somewhere in the darkness, the forest held its breath and waited. Corinne drove back to Pine Ridge early the next morning with the compass in her glove compartment, and questions multiplying in her mind. The town looked different somehow, smaller and more fragile in the morning light. She parked outside the library, a modest building that shared space with the community center. The librarian was a young woman named Sophie, maybe 30, who'd moved to Pine Ridge from Seattle to escape what she called the chaos of city life. She looked up from her computer when Corinne walked in, offering a warm smile. "Morning, Corinne. What can I help you with?" "I need to look at old newspapers," Corinne said. "From 1995 and 1996. Anything about the James Cordell case?" Sophie's smile faded slightly. "That's going back a ways. Let me check what we have on microfiche." 20 minutes later, Corinne sat at a reader, scrolling through digitized copies of the Pine Ridge Weekly Gazette. The coverage of Cordell's disappearance was surprisingly sparse. A brief article announced that a transient named James Cordell, age 32, had been reported missing after failing to check out of the Mountain View Motel. The search effort received mention in the following week's edition, but the details were vague. Search parties had combed the forest. No trace was found. The investigation remained open, but had no active leads. What struck Corinne was what wasn't there. No background on Cordell, no interviews with people who'd met him, no photographs. Just a few dry paragraphs treating his disappearance as an unfortunate but unremarkable event. She printed the articles and moved on to 1996. In June of that year, she found a small obituary for Deputy Raymond Thatcher, age 41, killed in a hunting accident in the National Forest north of town. The obituary praised his service to the community and mentioned that he was survived by a wife and 2 children. No details about the accident itself. Corinne sat back, her mind working. The initials on the tree, RT, 1996. Could that have been Raymond Thatcher? Had he returned to the forest after the search ended? And if so, why? She gathered her printouts and walked to Violet's house. The older woman was in her garden, tending to a bed of herbs that grew despite the short Montana growing season. She stood slowly when she saw Corinne approaching, brushing dirt from her hands. "You found something," Violet said. It wasn't a question. Corinne showed her the compass, told her about the plateau, the carvings, the rope. Violet's face remained calm, but something flickered in her eyes. "Come inside," Violet said. "We should talk." Her kitchen was warm and smelled of rising bread dough. Violet poured them both coffee and sat down across from Corinne at the small wooden table. She looked at the compass for a long moment before speaking. "James Cordell wasn't a drifter," she said quietly. "That's what they told people, but it wasn't true. He was a federal inspector. He came here to investigate timber theft from federal lands." Corinne's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. "What?" "There was an operation running back then. Illegal logging. Trees were being cut from federal property and sold through legitimate companies. Good money in it. James was getting close to proving who was involved when he disappeared." Violet's hands wrapped around her own cup. "Raymond Thatcher was one of the deputies assigned to the search. He died less than a year later. Officially, it was a hunting accident, but, well, some accidents are more convenient than others. Why didn't you tell me this before?" Corinne asked. "Because some truths are dangerous," Violet said. Because people have long memories and short tempers. Because I'm an old woman who likes her quiet life and doesn't want trouble. She met Corinne's eyes. But you've already found too much to turn back now. So I'm telling you, be careful. Whatever you're looking for out there, someone else might not want it found. Corinne spent the afternoon at the hardware store, buying a stronger flashlight and more rope. Lucas Gray watched her with a concerned expression, but didn't ask questions until she was checking out. "You planning to do some serious exploring?" he said, ringing up her purchases. "I found some things," she said carefully. "Old campsite, rope tied to trees, initials carved into the bark." Lucas was quiet for a moment. "You should talk to Tom Brennan." "Already did. He told me to be careful and call him if I found anything unusual." And I'm not sure I trust him," Corinne said. Lucas nodded slowly. "That's probably wise. Tom was a rookie during the Cordell investigation. He's a decent man, but he knows which side his bread is buttered on. Some of the people involved in that old timber business still have influence in this town." "Were you here back then?" Corinne asked. "I was. Kept my head down and my mouth shut, same as most people. That's how you survive in a small town." He handed her the bag with her purchases. "But I'll tell you this, if you need help, you come find me. I might not be brave, but I'm not a coward either." That evening, Corinne returned to the forest. This time she brought better equipment and a more systematic approach. She followed the rope from the plateau deeper into the woods, marking her trail with surveyor's tape as she went. The rope led down into a ravine she hadn't noticed before, a steep-sided cut in the landscape, hidden by heavy vegetation. At the bottom of the ravine, she found what she'd been looking for without knowing it. Tucked into a crevice in the rock face, protected from the weather by an overhang, was a waterproof pouch. The kind hikers use to keep important documents dry. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a photograph and a folded piece of paper. The photograph showed a man in his early 30s, lean and weathered, standing beside a woman with dark hair and warm eyes. They were both smiling, the man's arm around the woman's shoulders. On the back, someone had written, "James and Julia, September 1995. The paper was a note written in careful handwriting. "Meet me at the old cabin, midnight. We need to move the evidence before they find it. Be careful. I love you, Jay." Corinne read the note 3 times, her mind racing. James Cordell had a relationship with someone named Julia. They'd been planning to meet. There was evidence hidden somewhere, and someone, the people involved in the illegal logging, had been looking for it. She photographed everything with her phone, then carefully replaced the items in the pouch and returned it to its hiding place. The sun was setting, and she needed to get back to camp. But as she climbed out of the ravine, she couldn't stop thinking about the photograph, about the way James and Julia had looked at each other, about the love letter disguised as a warning. What had happened to Julia? Had she made it to the meeting? And where was this old cabin? Back at her camp, Corinne added the new information to her journal. A federal inspector investigating timber theft, a romantic relationship, a planned meeting that may never have happened, a deputy who died under suspicious circumstances. The pieces were starting to connect, but the picture they formed was darker than she'd expected. She looked at the broken compass again, at the needle spinning uselessly in its casing. Some things couldn't find their way home. Some things were lost beyond recovering. But some things, she thought, could still be found if someone was willing to look hard enough. Tomorrow she'd search for the cabin. Tomorrow she'd follow this trail wherever it led. But tonight she'd rest and prepare. Because Violet was right about one thing. Some truths were dangerous. And Corinne was getting close to a truth that people had spent 30 years trying to bury. The coordinates were carved into a pine tree near the ravine, so faint and weathered that Corinne almost missed them. She'd been searching systematically, examining every tree within a 100-yard radius of where she'd found the waterproof pouch. The numbers were barely visible, worn by decades of weather, but unmistakable once she knew what she was looking for. 47 by 2891, 134,556. She entered them into her GPS unit, a device she'd borrowed from Lucas and watched as it calculated her position. The destination was approximately 2 miles northeast, deeper into her property than she'd yet ventured. She marked her current location, shouldered her pack and started walking. The terrain grew rougher as she traveled. The forest floor rose and fell in steep ridges, and she found herself scrambling over fallen logs and pushing through thick underbrush. But every quarter-mile or so she'd find another mark, a cairn of stacked stones, a blaze cut into a tree bark, subtle signs that someone had traveled this route many times and wanted to find their way back. After an hour of steady hiking, she found the hollowed tree. It was an old Douglas fir, dead on one side, but still alive enough to remain standing. Someone had cut a cavity into the dead section, about chest height, and sealed it with a fitted piece of wood that blended almost perfectly with the surrounding bark. If she hadn't been looking for signs, she would have walked right past it. Inside the cavity was another waterproof container, this one larger, and inside that container was a hand-drawn map. The map was detailed and precise, drawn on heavy paper with waterproof ink. It showed the forest in sections, with landmarks labeled in neat handwriting. The creek, the plateau, the ravine, and there, in the far northeastern corner, a small square marked cabin. Paths were traced between the locations, including several routes that wound through difficult terrain, clearly designed to avoid being seen from the main trails. Someone had spent considerable time making this map. Someone who knew these woods intimately and needed to navigate them without being noticed. Corinne studied the map carefully, committing as much as possible to memory before photographing it and returning it to its hiding place. The cabin was roughly a mile from her current position, but the map showed the approach required care. There were notes along the routes: exposed ridge, loose rock, watch for deadfall. This wasn't just a map. It was a survival guide. She was folding her GPS unit back into her pack when she heard the voice, not close but not far either. A man's voice speaking in measured tones. Then a pause and another voice responding. She couldn't make out the words, but the sound was unmistakable. People here. In the forest that was supposed to be empty. Corinne froze, her heart hammering. She slowly lowered her pack to the ground and moved quietly behind a thick stand of evergreens. Through the branches, she could see two figures moving along a game trail about 50 yards away. Both were men, both dressed in outdoor gear. One carried what looked like a camera with a long lens. The other had binoculars around his neck. They weren't hikers out for a casual walk. They moved with purpose, pausing occasionally to scan the forest around them, looking for something. Or someone. She stayed perfectly still, barely breathing, until they passed out of sight. Then she waited another 10 minutes before moving, making sure they were truly gone. When she finally shouldered her pack again, her hands were shaking. Someone else was interested in this forest. The question was whether they were connected to the old case or were simply wildlife photographers or surveyors. But the timing seemed too convenient. She'd been asking questions in town, talking to Violet and Lucas. Had word gotten back to people who wanted the past to stay buried? She decided to postpone her search for the cabin. Instead, she took a circuitous route back toward her camp, moving as quietly as possible and checking frequently to make sure she wasn't being followed. The walk took twice as long as it should have, but she saw no further signs of the two men. When she reached her campsite, she found Sheriff Tom Brennan waiting by her tent. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his patrol vehicle parked on the access road a quarter-mile away. His expression was carefully neutral. "Corinne," he said as she approached. "We need to talk." She set down her pack, taking her time, using the moment to compose herself. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" "I heard you've been asking questions around town. About the Cordell case. About Deputy Thatcher." He paused. "I thought I told you to call me if you found anything unusual." "I found an old campsite and some carved initials," she said carefully. "Didn't seem worth bothering you over." Brennan studied her for a moment. "You're playing with fire here, Corinne. That case is old and cold. Some people would prefer it stayed that way." "What people?" He was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. Then he sighed and sat down on a fallen log near her fire ring. He looked older suddenly, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. "I was 23 when James Cordell disappeared," he said. fresh out of the academy, eager to prove myself. I was assigned to the search party, and I went out there every day for 2 weeks. We found nothing, not a trace. My sergeant at the time, a man named Carl Reynolds, he kept the search focused on specific areas. Said there was no point wasting resources on the deep forest where Cordell couldn't have gotten to on foot. But he could have, Corinne said. Yes, he could have. Brennan rubbed his face with both hands. After the search was called off, Ray Thatcher came to me. Said he'd found something in the woods. Said we needed to look again, further in. I told him to take it to Reynolds. He did. Reynolds shut him down. Told him to drop it or face disciplinary action. And then Thatcher died. Hunting accident. Or so the report said. Brennan looked up at her. I've carried that with me for 30 years. The wondering. The guilt. Ray had a family, good man. And he died less than a year after he tried to reopen the case. Corinne sat down across from him. Why are you telling me this now? Because you're going to keep digging no matter what I say. And because you deserve to know what you're up against. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. Carl Reynolds is retired now, living in Florida. But some of the others are still around. Still have money. Still have influence. They don't want this case reopened, Corinne. They've made that clear over the years. Who's they? Brennan shook his head. I can't give you names. I won't put a target on your back any more than it already is. But I will tell you this. If you find something concrete, something that can't be ignored, you don't bring it to me. You go straight to the state police or the FBI. You understand? She nodded slowly. You think I'm in danger. I think anyone who gets too close to the truth about what happened to James Cordell has historically had bad things happen to them. Ray Thatcher, a journalist from Missoula who was writing a story about it in 1998, his car went off a mountain road in a snowstorm. The motel owner who rented Cordell his room, her place burned down in 2001. Could all be coincidence? He stood up. But I don't believe in that many coincidences. He walked back toward the trail, then stopped and turned. One more thing. You see anyone else in these woods, anyone at all, you leave immediately. Don't confront them. Don't try to be brave. Just get out and get somewhere with people around. Promise me. I promise, she said, though they both knew she was lying. After Brennan left, Corinne built up her fire and made herself eat, though she barely tasted the food. Her mind was racing, connecting pieces. James Cordell had been investigating illegal timber operations. He'd found evidence. He'd had a relationship with someone named Julia. He'd planned to move that evidence before they found it. And then he'd vanished. Deputy Thatcher had tried to reopen the case and died. A journalist had investigated and died. The motel owner had died. Anyone who got too close to the truth seemed to end up dead. But she wasn't going to stop. She couldn't. Because if Cordell had been murdered, if there had been a cover-up, then someone needed to bring it to light. For Cordell, for Thatcher, for Julia, whoever she was, for everyone who'd been silenced. As darkness fell, Corinne pulled out the map fragment she'd photographed and studied it by firelight. The cabin was marked clearly. Tomorrow she'd find it. Tomorrow she'd see what secrets it held. But tonight, she'd sleep lightly with her knife close at hand, listening for footsteps in the darkness and wondering who else was watching these woods, waiting to see what she'd discover. The morning dawned grey and cold, with fog settling thick in the valleys. Corinne packed light, just water, energy bars, her knife, and the GPS unit with the cabin coordinates programmed in. She left her tent standing, and most of her gear behind. If she had to move fast, she didn't want to be weighed down. The map fragment proved accurate. Following its guidance, she avoided the exposed ridges and stuck to the cover of heavy timber. The route was longer but safer, winding through terrain that would hide her from anyone watching from a distance. The fog helped too, reducing visibility to maybe 50 yards. 2 hours into her hike, she found the collapsed structure. It wasn't the cabin, too small, and the construction was different. This looked like it had been a shed or storage building, built from rough-cut lumber that had rotted and fallen in on itself. Rusted equipment lay scattered in the ruins, a 2-man saw, several wedges, what might have been part of a portable sawmill. She searched carefully through the debris, using a stick to move aside the rotten wood and twisted metal. That's when she found the badge. It was tarnished, almost black, but when she rubbed it with her thumb, she could make out the engraving. Deputy R. Thatcher, Pine Ridge Sheriff's Department. The pin on the back was broken, as if it had been torn from clothing rather than carefully removed. Corinne held the badge for a long moment, feeling the weight of it. Ray Thatcher had been here, at this site. Whether he'd lost the badge accidentally or it had been taken from him, she couldn't tell. But its presence confirmed what Sheriff Brennan had implied. Thatcher had found something in these woods, something that connected to the illegal logging operation. She photographed the badge from multiple angles, then slipped it into her pocket. Evidence. Real, physical evidence that could be tested, traced, verified. This wasn't just old rumors or faded newspaper articles. This was concrete. The cabin appeared through the fog, like something from a dream. It sat in a small clearing, backed against a rock face that provided shelter from the north wind. The structure was old but remarkably well preserved, built from local timber with a shake roof that had somehow survived decades of mountain weather. Smoke damage blackened one wall, but the building was intact. Corinne approached carefully, watching for any signs of occupancy. The windows were shuttered from the inside. The door was closed but not locked. When she pushed it open, the hinges creaked in protest, but the door swung inward smoothly. The interior was dim and musty but dry. Someone had maintained this place. The floor was swept clean. Supplies lined the shelves. Canned goods, batteries, candles, matches. A wood stove sat cold in one corner, with split wood stacked neatly beside it. A simple cot occupied another corner, with blankets folded at its foot, and on a rough-hewn table in the center of the room sat a leather-bound ledger. Corinne lit one of the candles and sat down at the table. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the ledger. The first page was dated August 1973. The entries that followed were meticulous records of timber sales, written in a tight, precise hand. Each entry listed a date, a location, a species and volume of timber, and a buyer. And beside each entry, a list of names with dollar amounts. She turned page after page, watching as the operation expanded through the late 70s and into the 80s. The amounts grew larger. The names multiplied. She recognized some of them. Men who'd been prominent in Pine Ridge during her time here, some still alive, some long dead. Then she reached September 1995, and the handwriting changed. These entries were in a different hand, clearer and more modern. Notes in the margins. Federal boundary violation confirmed. Transport routes mapped. Payment records matched timber sales. And then, Inspector J. Cordell, USFS. Evidence collected. Recommend immediate prosecution. James Cordell's report. He'd found this ledger, documented the operation, and hidden his findings here in the cabin. This was the evidence he'd meant to move. This was what had gotten him killed. Corinne turned more pages and found photographs tucked between them, pictures of logging operations, trucks loaded with timber, men she recognized from town. One photo showed a younger Carl Reynolds, Brennan's, old sergeant standing beside a logging truck with his arm around another man. On the back, someone had written, Reynolds and Hutchins, 1982. The last pages of the ledger contained more recent entries. Not logging records, but notes. Site maintained. Supplies restocked. Perimeter check. No signs of intrusion. Winter provisions adequate. The entries were dated, the most recent from just 2 weeks ago. Someone was still using this cabin. Someone was still here, in the forest, maintaining this place. Corinne's skin prickled. She stood quickly, moving to the window. Through the shutters, she could see the clearing, the trees beyond. The fog had thickened, making it impossible to see more than a few yards. Anyone could be out there. Anyone could be watching. She heard it then, a sound that didn't belong. Not the wind, not an animal, a human sound. A cough, quickly stifled. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She moved away from the window, pressing herself against the wall beside the door. The candle still burned on the table, announcing her presence. But if she blew it out now, whoever was outside would know she'd heard them. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. Corinne gripped her knife, though she knew it would be useless against someone determined to harm her. She should have listened to Brennan. She should have brought the state police. She should have. The door opened. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, tall and lean, with grey hair and a weathered face. He wore outdoor clothes faded with age and use. In his hands, he carried a box of supplies. He looked at Corinne, at the knife in her hand, at the ledger open on the table. Then he spoke, his voice rough from disuse but steady. "I wondered when someone would finally find this place," he said. He set down the box of supplies and stepped into the cabin, pushing back the hood of his jacket. His eyes were grey-blue, sharp and intelligent. "My name is James Cordell, and I think it's time I told you what really happened 30 years ago." Corinne's knife hand dropped to her side. She stared at the man in front of her, at his face that matched the photograph from the waterproof pouch, aged by 3 decades but unmistakably the same person. James Cordell, not dead, not missing here, alive. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I know," he said quietly, "but here I am anyway." James Cordell moved around the cabin with the ease of long familiarity, lighting the wood stove and putting water on to boil. Corinne sat at the table, still clutching the knife, her mind struggling to process what her eyes were telling her. This man had been dead for 30 years. The whole town believed it. She'd believed it. "You're wondering if I'm real," he said, not looking at her. "Or if you've finally lost your mind out here in the woods. I understand. It's a lot to take in." "They searched for you," Corinne managed. "For weeks. They searched where Carl Reynolds told them to search, which wasn't anywhere near here." He poured hot water over instant coffee in 2 tin cups, set one in front of her. "Reynolds knew where I was going because I told him, thought I could trust him. Turns out he was on the timber company payroll, had been for years." Corinne wrapped her hands around the cup, feeling the warmth. Real, solid, not a hallucination. "What happened?" James sat down across from her, his face lined with a weariness that went beyond age. "I was a federal forestry inspector based out of Missoula. Got assigned to investigate reports of illegal timber sales in this district. Spent 3 months gathering evidence, documenting everything. Found the operation was bigger than anyone suspected. Millions of dollars over 20 years. Federal timber sold off the books, transported through legitimate operations to hide the source." He gestured to the ledger. "Found this in a trailer they were using as an office. Thought I'd hit the jackpot. Had names, dates, locations, everything needed for prosecution. I made copies, hid the originals here, and contacted my supervisor. That was my mistake." "What happened?" "My supervisor called the local law enforcement to coordinate the raid, which meant he called Carl Reynolds, and Reynolds called the people running the operation." James took a sip of his coffee. "They came for me that night. 3 men. Caught me at the motel. I fought back, got away, made it to the woods, but Reynolds himself caught up to me about 2 miles from here. Shot me." He pulled aside his jacket collar, showing a puckered scar above his collarbone. "Bullet went through, missed anything vital. But Reynolds thought I was dead, left me bleeding in a ravine." "Julia found you," Corinne said, remembering the photograph. Something softened in James's face. Julia Farrow. She was a teacher in Pine Ridge, local woman, born and raised. We'd met a few times during my investigation. She helped me understand the town, the people. We'd become close. When I didn't show up for a meeting we'd planned, she went looking, found me half dead in the rain. She saved your life." "She did. Got me to this cabin. She knew about it from when she was a kid. Used to be a hunting lodge. Patched me up, kept me alive through the infection and the fever, and when I was well enough to think clearly, we talked about what to do." He stood, walked to the window. "I wanted to go to the authorities, report what happened, bring everyone down. But Julia pointed out the obvious. Reynolds was the authorities. My supervisor had clearly been compromised. He'd given Reynolds my location. How far up did the corruption go? Who could we trust?" You could have gone to the FBI and said what? A dead man came back to accuse a decorated law enforcement officer of attempted murder, with evidence that I'd taken from a crime scene without proper custody procedures. He shook his head. They would have buried it, and they would have buried Julia for helping me. So we made a different choice. You disappeared. I disappeared. Julia reported seeing my rental car abandoned near the forest. The search went exactly where Reynolds wanted it to go. Nowhere near here. After a few weeks, they gave up. I was declared missing, presumed dead. And Julia went back to her life, pretending nothing had changed. Corinne thought of the careful entries in the ledger, the maintained cabin, the supplies. But she kept helping you. Every week for 30 years. She brings supplies, news from town, keeps me connected to the world. She's given up her whole life to protect mine. His voice cracked slightly. She should have had a husband, children, a real life. Instead, she's spent 3 decades keeping a secret that could get her killed. Why not leave? Go somewhere else? Start over. James turned to face her. At first, I was too weak. Then I was too angry, wanted to stay and watch them, make sure they didn't hurt anyone else. By the time I thought about leaving, 10 years had passed, 15, 20. How do you come back from the dead after 20 years? What life could I possibly build? And Julia, she chose to stay. Said leaving would be suspicious, that people would ask questions. So we built this life instead, hidden, secret, together. She's Violet Marsh, Corinne said suddenly, the pieces clicking into place. Your neighbor. She's been guiding me to you. James smiled for the first time, a sad, tired expression. Julia always was smarter than anyone gave her credit for. She knew when you bought this land that eventually you'd find me. She made sure you'd understand when you did. He pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. The operation ended in the late 90s. Most of the principals are dead now or retired. But a few are still around, still powerful, still willing to protect their secrets. That's why I'm telling you all this. Because you need to understand what you're up against. Corinne pulled Deputy Thatcher's badge from her pocket and set it on the table. I found this at the old logging site. James picked it up, his expression darkening. Ray Thatcher, good man. He found evidence, tried to reopen the case. They made it look like a hunting accident. He set the badge down gently. That's what they do. They make problems disappear. They've done it before. They'll do it again. Then we bring them down, Corinne said. We take this evidence to the FBI, we tell your story, and put Julia at risk. After everything she's sacrificed. Julia can handle herself, a voice said from the doorway. They both turned. An elderly woman stood there, her silver hair in its usual braid, her eyes the same ones from the photograph taken 30 years ago. Violet Marsh, Julia Farrow, the same woman who'd brought Corinne bread and preserves, who'd sat with her on the porch and told her to trust her instincts. Hello, James, she said softly. Then she looked at Corinne. I think it's time we stopped hiding. Julia crossed the cabin and embraced James with a familiarity that spoke of decades, not days. Corinne watched them, seeing now what she'd missed before. The way Violet had known exactly where to send her, how to guide her questions, what information to reveal and when. Every conversation had been carefully orchestrated to lead to this moment. You're angry, Julia said, reading Corinne's expression. I would be too. You manipulated me, Corinne said. Used me? I guided you, Julia corrected gently. There's a difference. I couldn't simply tell you the truth. You wouldn't have believed me, and it would have put you in immediate danger. But if you discovered it yourself, piece by piece, you'd understand the whole picture, and you'd be invested in the outcome. She sat down at the table, James taking the seat beside her, their hands finding each other automatically. Corinne could see it now, 30 years of secret partnership, of shared struggle, of love, maintained in the shadows. The sacrifice of it staggered her. Tell me everything, Corinne said. No more games, no more careful guidance. The whole truth. James and Julia exchanged a look, and some unspoken communication passed between them. Then James began to speak. I arrived in Pine Ridge in August of 1995. I was 32, ambitious, determined to make a name for myself in the Forest Service. The investigation was supposed to be routine, some discrepancies in timber sale reports, probably just accounting errors. But the deeper I dug, the more I found. He pulled the ledger closer. This documented 22 years of systematic theft. Federal timber worth tens of millions of dollars, sold through a network of legitimate lumber companies who claimed it came from private land. The operation was sophisticated. They had people in the Forest Service, in local law enforcement, even in the county assessor's office to falsify property records. The principal organizer was a man named Edward Hutchins, Julia added. He owned the biggest lumber mill in the county, employed half the town at one point. He's dead now, died of a heart attack in 2003. But his son runs the business, and others involved are still around. Carl Reynolds, Corinne said. Brennan's old sergeant. Reynolds was the enforcement arm, James said. He made sure local investigations went nowhere. He was supposed to coordinate the search for me, which meant making sure I stayed lost. And he was supposed to make sure I stayed dead. He pulled a small metal box from a shelf and opened it. Inside was a federal ID badge, the plastic cracked and discolored. A bullet hole punched through the center, right through the photograph of a younger James Cordell. Reynolds fired 3 times. First shot went through my badge. I had it clipped to my jacket. Second shot hit me in the shoulder. Third missed because I was already falling. He touched the scarred badge almost tenderly. I should have died that night. Would have, if not for Julia. Julia continued the story. I found him just after dawn. I'd been searching all night. When I saw him in that ravine, covered in blood, I thought I was too late. But he was breathing, barely. I got him here to the cabin. My grandfather built this place in the 60s. It was supposed to be a hunting lodge, but he never finished it. Nobody from town came up here anymore. You were a teacher, Corinne said. You had a life. I had a life that would have continued in Pine Ridge the same way it always had. Predictable, safe, unremarkable. Then I met James, and suddenly I had a choice. Let him die and protect myself, or save him and risk everything. She smiled slightly. It wasn't really a choice at all. She described those early months, nursing James back to health, sneaking supplies from town, lying to friends and family about where she spent her time. When James was strong enough, they discussed options. Going public seemed impossible. The corruption ran too deep, and they had no way to know who could be trusted. Deputy Thatcher approached me 3 months after James disappeared, Julia said. He'd been part of the search party, and something about the whole situation bothered him. He started asking questions, looking into things. He found evidence that Reynolds had been at the motel the night James vanished, even though Reynolds claimed he was elsewhere. Ray came to me because he knew James and I had been friendly. You told him the truth, Corinne asked. Not all of it. I said I thought James might have been killed, that I'd found his jacket in the woods with blood on it. I gave Ray enough to keep investigating without revealing that James was still alive. Julia's face darkened. He found the old logging site, found evidence that Reynolds had been involved in the timber operation. He was going to reopen the case officially. Then he died, James said flatly. Hunting accident, they said. His rifle discharged while he was climbing over a fence. Except Ray was an experienced hunter. He'd never make that kind of mistake. After Ray died, I knew we couldn't risk anyone else, Julia continued. So I changed my life, gradually, carefully. I stopped socializing as much, became more reclusive, told people I preferred my own company. Eventually, I stopped being Julia Farrow and became Violet Marsh, at least in how people thought of me. An eccentric old woman who minded her own business. And you kept visiting James, Corinne said. For 30 years, every week, sometimes more. We built a life here in secret. It wasn't the life either of us would have chosen, but it was ours. We grew old together in this forest, watching the seasons change, taking care of each other. Julia's voice was steady, but her eyes glistened. Most people search their whole lives for what we found. We were just lucky enough to recognize it. James reached into the metal box again and pulled out a sealed envelope, thick and yellowed with age. This is my original report to the Forest Service. Copies of the ledger pages, photographs, maps, everything needed to prosecute the case. I've kept it all these years, waiting for the right time. Why now? Corinne asked. James met her eyes. Because I'm dying. Heart disease. The doctors in town, I see one in Missoula twice a year under a false name, give me maybe 2 years. And because Julia deserves to stop living in the shadows. She's given me 30 years. I want to give her the rest of her life back. And because you bought this land, Julia added, which means legally you have the right to be here, to investigate, to find things. When we come forward, you're not a co-conspirator hiding a fugitive. You're a property owner who discovered evidence of a crime and brought it to the authorities. Corinne felt the weight of it settling on her shoulders. They'd been planning this, preparing for someone like her to come along. She'd thought she was investigating on her own, but she'd been part of their plan all along. There are still people in Pine Ridge who'll want this buried, she said. People with money and influence. 3 men, James confirmed. Marcus Doyle, the former sheriff. He's retired but still owns half the commercial property in town. Kenneth Hutchins, Edward's son. He inherited the lumber business and the family secrets. And Judge Warren Prescott, who made sure any legal inquiries went nowhere. They're all in their 70s or 80s now, but they're still dangerous. They've been watching this forest for 30 years, Julia said. They know someone's been maintaining this cabin. They probably have surveillance equipment in the woods. That's why we've been so careful. The 2 men I saw, Corinne said. With the camera and binoculars. Probably Doyle's people, James said. He'll have heard by now that you're asking questions. He'll be nervous. Julia stood and walked to the window, looking out at the fog-shrouded forest. We can end this. We can bring them all down, clear James's name, bring justice for Ray Thatcher and everyone else they hurt. But it has to be done right. We need a plan. Corinne looked at the sealed envelope, at the bullet-scarred badge, at the 2 people who'd sacrificed everything for truth and for each other. She thought about Robert, about the life they'd planned and never got to live. She thought about second chances and doing the right thing even when it cost you everything. Then let's make a plan, she said. They spent the rest of that day in the cabin, planning. James spread maps across the table, marking surveillance locations he'd identified over the years. Julia listed the people they could trust, a short list, and those who'd actively worked against the truth. Corinne documented everything with her phone camera, knowing they'd need evidence of their evidence. The key is getting everything to the right people without getting killed in the process, James said. We can't just walk into the Pine Ridge Sheriff's office. Brennan might be sympathetic, but he's not in control. And anyone we contact locally could tip off Doyle and the others. What about the FBI field office in Missoula? Corinne suggested. That's our best bet. But it's a 3-hour drive, and once we leave this forest, we're exposed. Doyle has people watching the main roads. If they see Julia and me together, alive, they'll know exactly what's happening. James traced a route on the map. We need a distraction. Something to draw their attention while we move the evidence out. Julia was quiet for a moment, then spoke. Lucas Gray. Both James and Corinne looked at her. Lucas has been helping us for years, Julia explained. He's known James was alive since about 2005. He's been our connection to the outside world, buying supplies, no questions asked. He's trustworthy, and he has legitimate reasons to drive to Missoula regularly for his hardware store. You trust him with this? Corinne asked. With my life, Julia said simply. He's earned it 100 times over. As the sun began to set, Lucas arrived at the cabin. He'd hiked in from the east, carrying a heavy pack filled with fresh supplies. When he saw Corinne sitting with James and Julia, he stopped in the doorway and smiled. So she found you, he said to James. About time. Hello, Lucas, James replied. Thanks for coming. Lucas set down his pack and pulled up a chair. He was a solid man, weathered by years of honest work, with eyes that missed very little. Julia sent word you needed help. What's the situation? They explained the plan. Lucas would take the sealed envelope and all the evidence to Missoula, directly to the FBI field office. He'd presented as something a customer, Corinne, had found on her property and asked him to deliver. That would protect Lucas from accusations of harboring a fugitive or obstructing justice. Meanwhile, Corinne would stay at the cabin with James and Julia, making it look like she was still investigating, still searching. What if Doyle's people come for you? Lucas asked. Then we're here together with documentation of everything. 3 witnesses instead of 1. James looked at Julia. And we're not running anymore. Whatever happens, we face it. Lucas studied them for a long moment, then nodded. All right. I'll head out first thing tomorrow morning. Drive straight through. Should have it in federal hands by noon. He looked at Corinne. You sure about this? Once this goes public, your life in Pine Ridge is going to get complicated. I bought 30 acres of forest for $400, Corinne said. I think I can handle complicated. That night they took shifts keeping watch. The fog had lifted, and the moon was bright enough to see by. Corinne took the first shift, sitting by the window with James's binoculars, scanning the tree line. Julia slept in the cot, and James rested in a chair, his breathing steady but labored. His heart condition was worsening. Corinne could see it in the way he moved, the fatigue that settled over him by evening. Around midnight, Julia woke and joined Corinne at the window. He's not going to last 2 years, Julia said quietly. Maybe not even 1. The doctors say the stress of hiding all these years, the lack of proper medical care, it's taken a toll. I'm sorry, Corinne said. Don't be. We've had 30 years. That's more than most people get. Julia's voice was soft but steady. He wants to die with his name cleared. He wants people to know he wasn't a coward who ran away, that he tried to do the right thing. What about you? What do you want? Julia smiled slightly. I want to marry him, properly, legally, in front of people. I want to walk down the street holding his hand. I want 1 year, 1 month, 1 day of not hiding. That would be enough. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the moonlight filter through the trees. Then Julia spoke again. When I found him in that ravine, bleeding and barely conscious, I made a choice. Not just to save him, but to love him, whatever the cost. People think love is about the good times, the easy moments. But real love is about the choice you make when everything is hard. When staying means giving up the life you thought you'd have. When the price is everything and you pay it anyway. Corinne thought about Robert, about the life they'd built and lost. I understand, she said. I know you do. That's why I knew you were the right person. Lucas left before dawn, carrying the sealed envelope and copies of everything they'd documented. He clasped James's hand, hugged Julia, and told Corinne he'd call her cell phone as soon as he reached the FBI office, assuming she had signal by then. After he left, the waiting began. James checked and rechecked the cabin's defenses, making sure the shutters could be barred from inside, that they had adequate supplies if they needed to hole up. Julia went through the evidence one more time, making sure they hadn't missed anything crucial. Corinne hiked down to her campsite to retrieve the rest of her gear. The morning was clear and cold, frost glittering on the pine needles. When she reached her tent, she found it had been searched. Not ransacked, but carefully gone through. Her sleeping bag was unzipped, her pack's contents rearranged, her journal pages bent as if someone had photographed them. They knew. Doyle's people knew she'd found something. They were looking for the evidence, trying to figure out how much she'd discovered. She packed quickly, erasing her campsite, leaving no trace. As she hiked back toward the cabin, she had the distinct sensation of being watched. She didn't run, didn't let on that she noticed. But she varied her route and doubled back twice to make sure she wasn't being followed. When she reached the cabin, James took one look at her face and knew. They've been to your camp, he said. Someone has. They went through everything. James moved to the window, scanning the forest with practiced eyes. They're getting desperate. That means Lucas has them worried. They know something's happening, but they don't know what. The afternoon crawled by. No cell signal. No word from Lucas. They took turns at the window, watching, waiting. James taught Corinne some of the signals he'd developed over the years. Bird calls that meant danger, arrangements of stones that marked safe paths. Survival skills learned through 3 decades of hiding. Around 4 o'clock, Julia stiffened at the window. Vehicle sounds. Down on the access road, they all listened. The distant rumble of engines, multiple vehicles. Then silence as the engines cut off. How many? James asked. At least 2, maybe 3. James pulled a 2-way radio from a shelf, an old model he'd modified to monitor law enforcement frequencies. He turned it on, adjusted the squelch, and they listened. Static, then voices. Confirmed she's still in the area. Trucks at the trailhead. Copy that. Brennan says she was asking about the cabin. Probably found it by now. Doyle wants this cleaned up today. No loose ends. The voice was cold, professional. Not local law enforcement. These were Doyle's private security people, the kind with military backgrounds and no qualms about following orders. James looked at Julia, then at Corinne. They're coming. We need to decide right now. Do we run or do we stand? Lucas has the evidence, Julia said. It's probably in FBI hands already. Running now doesn't change that. But staying could get us killed, Corinne pointed out. Maybe, James said. Or maybe they just want to scare us. Find out what we know, what we've done with the information. If they kill us without knowing where the evidence is, they risk it surfacing. Later. That's a hell of a gamble, Corinne said. James smiled grimly. I've been gambling for 30 years. One more bet won't hurt. They prepared the cabin for defense. Barred the shutters, moved supplies away from the windows, positioned themselves where they could see all approaches. James had weapons, a rifle he'd acquired years ago for hunting, a pistol Julia had brought him, but he made it clear they'd use them only as an absolute last resort. We're not killers, he said. We're witnesses. We survive by outlasting them, not outfighting them. As the sun dropped toward the western mountains, they heard the first sounds of people moving through the forest. Boots on pine needles, the snap of a branch, voices calling coordinates to each other. Julia reached for James's hand. Corinne checked her phone one more time. Still no signal, but she'd set it to record video as soon as anything started. Evidence. Always evidence. The radio crackled. Visual on the cabin. Smoke from the chimney. Definitely occupied. Another voice, older, authoritative. Surround it. Don't let anyone leave. And remember, we need to know what they've told people before we do anything permanent. Marcus Doyle's voice. The former sheriff himself had come to clean up his mess. James looked at Corinne and Julia, his expression calm despite the situation. Whatever happens, we tell the truth. That's all we've ever wanted to do. Just tell the truth. The truth, Julia echoed. And trust that it's enough, Corinne added. They waited. The three of them together in the cabin, James and Julia, had made their home for 3 decades. As the forest around them filled with men who wanted that truth buried forever. The sun touched the mountain peaks, painting the sky gold and crimson. In the distance, a hawk cried out, and somewhere on a highway to Missoula, Lucas Gray drove toward the FBI office, carrying evidence that would either save them or make their last stand meaningful. The cabin door shuddered under a heavy knock. Federal Inspector James Cordell, a voice called. We know you're in there. Time to come out and talk. James stood, straightened his shoulders, and walked toward the door. Julia rose with him, her hand still in his. And Corinne stood with them both, 3 witnesses ready to face whatever came next, bound together by truth and courage and the simple human need to do what's right. No matter the cost, James opened the door slowly, standing in the threshold with Julia beside him and Corinne behind. Marcus Doyle stood 15 feet away, flanked by 2 younger men in tactical gear. Doyle was in his late 70s, but age hadn't softened him. He had the bearing of a man used to being obeyed, used to getting his way. James Cordell, Doyle said, his voice carrying a mixture of surprise and something darker. I'll be damned. We all thought you were dead. You made sure everyone thought that, James replied evenly. You and Carl Reynolds. Carl's been dead 10 years. Can't answer for what he did or didn't do. Doyle's eyes shifted to Julia, and Violet Marsh, or should I say Julia Farrow. I always wondered about you. The way you changed after Cordell disappeared. The way you kept to yourself. He smiled without warmth. You've been hiding him all this time. I've been protecting him, Julia said. From people like you. Doyle gestured to the men with him. These gentlemen are private security. They work for me and several other concerned citizens who want to maintain Pine Ridge's reputation. We can't have wild accusations about decades-old timber operations disrupting our community. Timber theft, Corinne said, stepping forward. Federal land, millions of dollars. That's not a wild accusation, it's documented fact. Doyle's attention shifted to her. Miss Vale, you've been very busy since you bought that land. Asking questions, poking around where you don't belong. That was foolish. I own this property, Corinne said. Everything on it belongs to me, including anything I find here. Found anything interesting? Doyle asked, his tone deceptively casual. James held up his hand, stopping Corinne from answering. You came here to find out what we know and where the evidence is. I'll save you the trouble. Everything, the ledger, my original federal report, photographs, documents, is already in the hands of the FBI. You're too late. Doyle's expression hardened. You're bluffing. Lucas Gray left at dawn, Julia said. He's probably meeting with federal agents right now, giving them everything, names, dates, locations. The whole operation laid out in detail. One of the security men spoke into a radio. Check on Gray. Find out where he is. He listened to the response and his face tightened. Boss, they can't locate him. His truck's not at his store, and his wife says he left early this morning for Missoula. Doyle's jaw clenched. How long ago? James checked his watch. 8 hours. Even accounting for stops, he's been in Missoula for hours. Federal investigators are probably already reviewing the evidence. We can call it in, one of the security men suggested. Have someone intercept him. And do what? James asked. Assault a civilian on a public highway? Steal evidence from an FBI field office? You're former law enforcement, Doyle. You know how this works. Once the FBI has federal evidence of a federal crime, there's no putting that genie back in the bottle. Doyle stood silent, thinking. The radio crackled with updates. Sheriff's Department had been alerted. Vehicles were being dispatched, but it was clear from the chatter that they were scrambling. Reactive rather than proactive. You've ruined yourself for nothing, Doyle finally said. That investigation was closed 30 years ago. The principals are dead or dying. Who are you going to prosecute? What justice are you going to get? We're going to clear James's name, Julia said firmly. We're going to tell the truth about what happened. About the corruption, the cover-up, the murders disguised as accidents. Ray Thatcher deserves that. The journalist who died deserves that. Everyone who was silenced deserves the truth. Thatcher was an accident, Doyle insisted. Was it? James pulled Deputy Thatcher's badge from his pocket and held it up. Found this at the old logging site. Ray was investigating. He found evidence. Then he died, just like anyone who got too close. Doyle's eyes fixed on the badge, and for the first time, uncertainty crossed his face. Where did you get that? From the place where Ray died. Not on a fence during a hunting accident, but at the logging site, where he'd found proof of the operation. Someone killed him and staged it to look like an accident. Was it you, Marcus? Or did you have Reynolds do it? You can't prove anything, Doyle said, but his voice lacked conviction. We don't have to, Corinne said. The FBI will. They'll reopen everything. The timber theft, James's disappearance, Ray's death, all of it. And they'll find the truth, even if it takes years. The radio crackled again. Sheriff Brennan is on the line. Says he needs to talk to you, sir. Says it's urgent. Doyle took the radio, listened, and his face went pale. He spoke briefly, then handed the radio back. When he looked at them again, something had changed in his expression. The calculation was still there, but also resignation. Federal agents are in Pine Ridge, he said quietly. They're at the sheriff's office right now, requesting all files related to the Cordell case and the Thatcher death. Brennan called to warn me. He looked at James. You win. This wasn't about winning, James said. It was about truth. Doyle studied him for a long moment. Was it worth it? 30 years, hiding in the woods. Giving up your life? James looked at Julia, and his expression softened. Every single day, Doyle gestured to his men. Stand down, it's over. He looked back at James. You're going to testify. Tell them everything. That's exactly what I plan to do, James said. Then I want immunity, Doyle said. I was following orders back then. Carl Reynolds ran the operation. You were just protecting your investment, Julia cut in. You owned stock in Hutchins Lumber. You benefited financially from the theft. Don't pretend you were an innocent bystander. Doyle's face hardened. You can't prove that. Actually, we can, Corinne said. The ledger lists all the payoffs. Your name is in there, Marcus, along with the amounts and dates. The sound of vehicles grew louder. Not just one or two this time, but several. The radio came alive with chatter. Federal agents were en route to the cabin, accompanied by state police. Sheriff Brennan was with them, along with Lucas Gray. Doyle looked toward the sound, then back at James. "I could have killed you 30 years ago. Carl wanted to finish the job, but I talked him out of it. Told him a body would raise too many questions. I saved your life. You left me to die in a ravine," James said coldly. "Julia saved my life. You and Reynolds just failed to take it." The first vehicle appeared through the trees, a black SUV with federal plates. Behind it came 2 state police cruisers and Sheriff Brennan's patrol vehicle. Doors opened and agents emerged wearing FBI windbreakers. One of them, a woman in her 40s with steel-gray hair, approached the cabin. "Special Agent Rebecca Moss, FBI," she announced. "I'm looking for James Cordell and Julia Farrow." James stepped forward. "I'm James Cordell, Federal Forestry Inspector, listed as missing since September 1995. Agent Moss stopped, studying him carefully. "You have identification." James pulled out the bullet-scarred badge, along with a laminated ID card he'd kept protected all these years. Moss examined them both, comparing the photo to the man in front of her. Despite the aging, the resemblance was clear. "Mr. Cordell, I need you to come with us. We have a lot of questions." "I have a lot of answers," James replied. "But first, I need to know, did Lucas Gray deliver the evidence package?" "He did. That's why we're here. The contents are, well, explosive. If even half of what's in there is verified, this is going to be one of the biggest federal timber theft cases in Montana history." Moss looked at Doyle. "Marcus Doyle? Former Sheriff Doyle," he corrected. "Sir, I need you to come with us as well. We have questions about your involvement in the events of 1995. "I'm not saying anything without my lawyer," Doyle said. "That's your right," Moss agreed. "But you are coming with us." The state police officers moved forward, and Doyle's security personnel backed away, making it clear they weren't going to interfere with federal agents. Doyle was placed in one of the patrol vehicles, his expression stony. Agent Moss turned back to James and Julia. "We'll need formal statements from both of you, and from you, Miss Corinne Vale. I own this property. I'm the one who found the initial evidence. Then we'll need your statement as well." Moss looked at the cabin. "Is this where you've been living, Mr. Cordell?" "For 30 years, he confirmed. "Julia brought me supplies. Lucas Gray helped when he could. They kept me alive and kept the secret." "Why not come forward sooner?" James met her eyes. "Because the people who tried to kill me had power and connections. Because I didn't know who to trust. Because by the time enough years had passed, I'd made a life here, with Julia. And because I knew that eventually someone would find the truth." He glanced at Corinne. "I just didn't know it would take this long." Lucas appeared from one of the vehicles, grinning broadly. "Told you I'd get it done," he said to James. "Never doubted you," James replied, clasping his hand. "Thank you, old friend." Agent Moss organized the scene efficiently. James and Julia were asked to gather personal items they'd need for the next few days. Corinne collected her documentation, her photographs, her journal. The cabin was sealed as a crime scene. Evidence would need to be properly collected and catalogued. As they prepared to leave, Julia looked back at the cabin one last time. 30 years, she whispered. "It's strange to finally walk away." James put his arm around her. "We're not walking away. We're walking forward, together, in the sunlight instead of the shadows." They descended from the forest in a convoy of vehicles, leaving behind the cabin that had been home, prison, and sanctuary. As they reached the access road, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Corinne rode with Agent Moss, answering preliminary questions about how she'd found the compass, the photographs, the map. Through the window, she watched James and Julia in the vehicle ahead, their profiles silhouetted against the dying light. After 30 years of hiding, they were finally coming home. The truth was out. Justice, long delayed, was finally moving forward. And 3 people who'd started as strangers had become something more. Witnesses to each other's courage, defenders of a truth that others had tried to bury. The forest behind them stood silent in the gathering darkness, keeping its secrets no longer. 3 months later, Corinne stood on the porch of her new cabin, watching the first snow of the season drift down through the pines. The structure was simple but solid, built on the southern edge of her property where the ground was level and the sun came through in the mornings. Lucas had helped with the heavy work, and several people from town had volunteered their time once the whole story became public. The federal investigation had moved swiftly once the evidence was in their hands. The ledger, James's original report, and the testimony of multiple witnesses had been enough to indict 3 men, Marcus Doyle, Kenneth Hutchins, and Judge Warren Prescott. All were awaiting trial on charges of conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice. Additional charges related to Ray Thatcher's death were being considered. Though proving murder after 30 years was difficult, Carl Reynolds couldn't be prosecuted. He died a decade earlier, but his name had been formally stripped from the department's roll of honor. His pension had been revoked posthumously, with the funds designated for a scholarship in Ray Thatcher's name. James Cordell had been officially reinstated as a federal forestry inspector, with full back pay and benefits. The Forest Service had issued a formal apology for the institutional failures that had led to his disappearance. His medical benefits now covered the heart treatment he needed, and the doctor said that with proper care and reduced stress, he might have 5 years instead of 2. Julia had finally been able to drop the pretense of being Violet Marsh, though most people in town still called her by that name out of habit. She and James had married in a small ceremony at the county courthouse with Corinne and Lucas as witnesses. The judge, not Prescott, who'd been arrested, had smiled as he pronounced them husband and wife. "Better late than never," he'd said. They were living in Julia's house now, the one where she'd spent 30 years pretending to be a reclusive widow. James was slowly adjusting to being around people again, though he still preferred quiet and solitude. He and Julia took daily walks through town, no longer hiding their relationship. Some people stared, some whispered, but most just nodded respectfully and went about their business. Pine Ridge had been divided by the revelations. Some residents were angry that their town's reputation had been tarnished. Others were relieved that old secrets had finally been exposed. The younger generation mostly saw it as validation of what they'd suspected all along, that the town's leaders hadn't always been as honorable as they'd claimed. The Timber Lodge restaurant had become an impromptu gathering, place for discussions about the case. Corinne had overheard more than one conversation about how corruption could take root anywhere, how ordinary people sometimes looked away from injustice because it was easier than standing up. Sheriff Tom Brennan had given a televised interview, admitting his role in the inadequate search back in 1995. He'd been young and following orders, but that didn't excuse it. He'd offered to resign, but the town council had asked him to stay. "Sometimes the best thing we can do is learn from our mistakes and do better," the council president had said. A memorial had been erected for Deputy Raymond Thatcher in the town square. The plaque read, "He chose truth over comfort, courage over compliance. May we honor his memory by doing the same." Julia had cried when they unveiled it, and James had stood beside her with his hand on her shoulder, both of them finally able to publicly grieve for a man who'd tried to do the right thing. The media attention had been intense for the first month, reporters from across the state descending on Pine Ridge, wanting interviews and photographs. Corinne had given exactly one interview to a local newspaper, in which she'd emphasized that she'd just been someone who'd bought some land and followed where the evidence led. "James and Julia are the real heroes," she'd said. "They survived when others wanted them silenced. They protected the truth for 30 years. Now, as the snow accumulated on the pine branches, Corinne heard the sound of approaching footsteps. James and Julia appeared through the trees, walking slowly, matching their pace to James's current limitations. He looked better than he had 3 months ago, less haunted, more at peace. "We brought lunch," Julia announced, holding up a basket. "Thought we could eat on your new porch," They settled into the chairs Corinne had built, sharing sandwiches and coffee while watching the snow. The forest was beautiful in winter, Corinne thought. Quiet and clean and honest in its way. I've been thinking about the cabin, James said. The one where we lived all those years. The FBI released it back to you as the property owner. What would you like me to do with it? Corinne asked. James and Julia exchanged a look. Keep it, Julia said. Maintain it. It was our home for a long time. And maybe someday when we're gone, it can be a reminder. Not of hiding or fear, but of love. Of what people will do for each other when it matters. Corinne nodded. I can do that. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, three people bound together by circumstance and choice. Corinne thought about how she'd bought this land for $400, expecting to build a simple homestead and live a quiet life. Instead, she'd found a mystery, uncovered a conspiracy, and helped bring justice to people who'd waited 30 years for it. More than that, she'd found friends. Real friends, the kind who'd been tested by fire and emerged stronger. You know what I realized? Corinne said. When I bought this forest, people thought I was crazy, told me the land was cursed, that I'd regret it. But this land gave me more than I ever expected. Not just a home, but purpose, connection, a chance to do something that mattered. $400, Julia said, smiling. Best investment you ever made. Best investment any of us made, James agreed. You got a homestead. I got my name back. Julia got to stop hiding. And all of us got to see justice done. The snow continued to fall, blanketing the forest in white. In the distance, a hawk called out, its cry echoing through the trees. The sun broke through the clouds for just a moment, illuminating the clearing in golden light. Corinne looked at her friends, at the cabin she'd built, at the forest that had kept its secrets until someone was brave enough to find them. Sometimes the best things in life really do come when you have nothing left to lose. Sometimes a piece of cursed land turns out to be exactly what you need. And sometimes $400 can buy you more than property. It can buy you truth, justice, and the kind of friendships that last a lifetime. She raised her coffee cup. To second chances, she said. James and Julia raised theirs. To second chances, they echoed. And the forest around them, finally free of its burden of secrets, settled peacefully into winter.